Hey everyone, Jonathan Bailor here. Very, very happy to bring you today's guest, whose name is Adam Kosloff over at Caloriegate.com. The reason I wanted to bring Adam on the show was because he sent me over this black box report he's put together, and it really does an excellent job of taking some of the more esoteric and metaphysical aspects of health and weight that some people in the, let's call it, internet nutrition community like to talk about, and explaining them in incredibly simple terms, but I think most importantly, on distilling why it's important to understand that why. So we don't need to geek out and get all metaphysical, but understanding a little bit more deeply about how the body works. Obviously, we know how important that is to talk about the set point, but Adam's really taken an approach at this that I really, really like and wanted to bring him on the show so we could talk about it. So, Adam, thank you so much for joining us today.
Jonathan, thank you so much for having me on the show.
So, Adam, before we get into your black box report, I wanted to hear a little bit about what got you interested in this space in general, because this is not necessarily your day job or something you're formally trained in, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I took a sort of circuitous path to this. I went to Yale. I got a degree in physics. Then I moved out to Los Angeles to work as a screenwriter, and I actually got to write with Mel Brooks and do some stuff like that. But to pay my way, I wrote for the internet. And while I was doing all this stuff, I read Gary Taubes' book, Good Calories, Bad Calories. And I got so enraptured by sort of the concepts in this that I ended up going online and blogging about it and getting deeper and deeper into this crazy internet nutrition world. So that's my circuitous path.
Well, it sounds like, Adam, you noticed, or at least this is what I perceive you as noticing, I wanted to have you on the show. You noticed that, so Gary's work, anyone who's read it, I think, has had their minds opened, let's call it, but also bent a little bit, because he says things like these metaphysical concepts like, it's not that you're not getting obese because you're eating too much. You're eating too much because you're getting obese. And unless you are trained in like philosophical thought processes, you're kind of like, what? And
I know it's like Yoda, right?
Exactly. But what you did with this report, which I believe is freely available on your website, Caloriegate.com, was to, in very fun, you actually use some South Park analogies, which I personally love, distill more of the everyday person why this matters and some of the key distinctions that Gary and people like him are getting at. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. My job is I like to take complex ideas and distill them down for the masses. I love counterintuitive ideas. Like my bookshelves are like Nassim Taleb and Jim Collins. Like I love these. I love looking at old ideas from new ways.
Cool. Well, let's just get straight into it and talk about what the key. I think there's a couple key distinctions you draw in your black box report. And the two I'd love to dig into is just the concept of the black box in general and why that matters, and the mustache analogy, which is one of my favorite ones. And then also you have some really nice Venn diagrams. So let's just take those one at a time. And first, what is the black box? Why does it matter?
Okay, that's a great question. And, I'm just kind of still getting used to talking about these concepts, so forgive me in advance if I ramble a little bit. Here's the reality. When growth occurs in the body, whether you're talking about growing, a belly or a mustache or a baby, there's two things that have to happen always. The first thing is that there needs to be a calorie surplus. You need to take in more energy or mass than you burn off. That's the first law of thermodynamics. The second thing is there has to be some mechanism or mechanisms, biochemistry, that takes that mass and turns it into your body's tissues and structures. Now, this stuff is complex, and we can call it the black box. It's all the stuff that takes the hamburger and turns it into your beer belly, or actually I guess it would be beer to turn into a beer belly. But it's the stuff that transforms the substrate into you. Now, when we talk about all the other tissues in our body, growth, when we talk about growing a baby or growing a mustache or growing cancer or whatever, we always kind of intuitively know that the biochemistry matters, right? That it's the black box that's really important if we want to figure out why something's growing or why something's growing badly. Does that make sense so far?
It does. And let me just quickly summarize. And if there's a diagram you have in your report, which people can get at Caloriegate.com, which I would highly recommend them checking out. It's very, very simple. And I think it really drives home what you just said, which is the traditional way weight regulation is discussed is step one is calories are consumed. Step two is basically nothing, and step three is weight is gained or lost. And
Right.
and what you inject into that process is you say, well, there's step one, then there's a step two, which is this question mark thing, and then there's step three, which is not new, but something we need to pay attention to, which is this black box, which is this, let's call it biological intelligence that determines what happens with that caloric surplus, right? Because whether you're growing cancer, whether your hair is growing, or whether you're growing fat, different things happen for those those forms of growth to take place. So just saying that, well, when you take in more calories, it causes fat gain is missing something, because there's all kinds of growth that can happen in the body. Does that capture it?
If you think about, and the idea is our focus on calories is misplaced. And if we thought about other kinds of growth in our body, the way we think about fat tissue growth, we'd reach absurd conclusions. Like if you want to grow a baby, you don't try to overeat, even though overeating must take place if you want to grow a baby. If you have a mustache that is growing too long, you do not eat less and exercise more. You know what I mean? But when we talk about our fat tissue growth, we get it all mixed up.
So Adam, let's just pause right there, because I actually think you just captured that's it, right? Like that is the key point of,
right.
So here's the question for every listener, myself included, because every time I hear it, I get chills, because it's such a profound distinction to make in your mind, and it helps to free you from the eat less, exercise more mentality, right. Is if your hair is growing too long and you'd like to save some money and get haircuts less frequently, like for your hair to grow, you must have enough calories to fuel that process. Like you can imagine that actually creating hair must be biologically expensive. Like you're taking nothing and you're creating hair. So you're creating new tissue. But if you want your hair to grow slower or not to grow at all, you don't think to yourself, well, I'm just going to stop eating and I'm just going to exercise more. In fact, even if you starve yourself, your hair will still grow. Like your body's finding a way to get enough calories to trigger that process. So with hair growth or baby growth or cancer growth, we don't say to stop growth, eat less and exercise more. But with fat growth, we do. Why?
We do. And it's honestly, it's just this logical error that everyone's making. And it's become this ubiquitous truth. And if you think, and what's interesting about it is if you think about what would happen if you're pregnant, right? You're pregnant, you're growing a baby, and you don't like this growth. And you decide, I'm going to eat less and exercise more and starve myself to stop this growth. Well, the baby is kind of in business for itself, right? It will still grow inside of you, but you will have less energy. You will be cold. You'll be very hungry. And if you really starve yourself, the baby might not grow as big, but that's not because the baby's healthy. It's because the baby's sick. And if you think about the analogy between the baby growing and the fat tissue growing, I think it's apt, because if you look at people who have real obesity and they try to starve themselves to lose weight, exact same things happen. They get cold, they get tired, they get hungry, and they even lose lean muscle mass and organ mass because the fat tissue is in business for itself, because there's something wrong with the black box of the fat tissue.
And I love that, even taking it further, like the cancer analogy, right? And the preservation, like the baby's in business for itself. So if you have a cancerous tumor growing, and I know this is an example that Gary uses in his work, the treatment for cancer isn't to eat less, although one might think, well, if I don't have enough, if I don't take in enough energy, that must stop the cancer from growing. Well, actually, no, because something goes wrong in your body where the cancer growth almost continues at the expense of the rest of your health. There's this malfunction in the black box, or there's this malfunction in your biological processes that say this other thing growing is so important that I will basically sacrifice everything else. And they've shown this in lab rats, where they will genetically engineer lab rats who, when starved, will actually cannibalize their organs. Like they will die because they will eat their organs before they eat all of their body fat, because of this dysregulation or breakage of their quote unquote biological black box.
Exactly. And, and I'm going to get a little bit, I'm not going to geek out too much, but I want to just separate this concept that we're talking about, the black box. Taubes calls it lipophilia. There are other people who call it the neuroendocrine theory of obesity. This is one concept, and I want to separate that concept from another thing that's often tied to it, which is this idea they call the carbs insulin hypothesis, which is an idea that, for the most part, our fat is regulated by insulin, and that for the most part, our insulin is controlled by the quality and quantity of the carbs in our diet. Now, that's a separate idea. And if you think about it, I like to think about it as penicillin for the black box. If I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here, you can stop me if you want. But think about obesity as like getting a fever, right? If you have a 102-degree fever, that's not healthy. You want it to be 98.6. If you go to but fevers usually come bundled together with like a stuffy nose, sore throat, sneezes, and stuff like that. It's an infection, right? If you go to your doctor and you say, "Doctor, I've got this fever," and she only treats the fever, but not the other symptoms. And she says, "Hey, go home and take an ice bath, and that's going to fix everything." Because of the laws of physics demand that you will be cooled down when you go in the ice bath. It might give you, fix the fever a little bit, but it's not going to get at the root problem if you're sick. What you need to get better is you need to fix, the infection, the root cause of the fever. And so the point is that, like with obesity, there's an idea that as a kind of penicillin for the problems of the black box could be this carbs insulin idea, which is that when you lower carbs, you normalize insulin, and this makes the black box fixed. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense. And I think actually, Adam, this is the audience listening to this podcast, the Smarter Science of Slim listeners, I think will uniquely appreciate this, because what my research is right along these lines, which I call it you have a clog in your metabolic system. I use this thing called the clog sink analogy. Right. And I love what you're talking about a fever, because yes, you have a fever, you have this underlying problem, this underlying clog, let's call it, in your immune system. And you can take an ice bath, and on the surface that quote unquote works. And on the surface, if you eat less and exercise more, it quote unquote works. But we all understand that it's really not doing anything about the problem. I talk about you can turn off the faucet of a clogged sink and you can bail water out with a teaspoon, but in both cases the clog still exists. And in your analogy, the fever still exists. And in the analogy of the body, you still have this metabolic dysfunction. And the thought with Gary's work and individuals who are really into carbohydrate restriction is by restricting carbohydrate, you can restrict the production of insulin, which helps to clear this metabolic clog and thus fixing the root issue or the fever or the clog. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So I remember seeing your video and I was like, when I saw the metaphor about the clog, I'm like, that's exactly what I'm talking about. It's funny that we came up with these whatever, brilliant minds.
Great minds. Well, that's very kind. And the other thing I like about your analogy with the penicillin is a couple things. I think there's more, at least my research suggests there's definitely more going on here, and you capture this in your work than just insulin. For example, refined seed oils and the dysregulation in the brain of weight regulation has now been widely demonstrated. So it's more than insulin is a component, but it's not all of it. And you talk about that in your work as well.
Exactly. And that's the point I want to get across is that, it's not like low carb diets are a magic pill. Or that, there's nothing else going on, like the seed oils. And the other thing that I think is important is that some of the stuff can be non-diet related. When you talk about, trying to slim down, we were so focused on diet and exercise. But if this is really an endocrinological problem, the clogged sink thing, other things can clog the sink. Like, one thing that's very common is that people gain fat on medications like antihistamines, antidepressants, and these things are probably doing independent things to, the black box or the clogged sink. It may not be fixable through diet alone. This is a long-term things. And if you're just focused on calories and not thinking about these deeper issues, you're never going to fix the problem. You're going to, if you gain weight on an antidepressant, you might think I'll just starve myself to fix that problem when that might not work because it's not going to fix the clog.
Yeah, you're literally putting yourself in an ice bath to get rid of your fever. Like on the surface, And you might have a friend who's like, well, dude, just get in an ice bath. I did it. My fever went down immediately. But 2 months later, when they're still sick, and in fact, they're even worse because the fever hasn't been taken care of, then they'll be singing a different story. But it is such the reason I wanted to have you on the show and go over this stuff. And really, I mean, I think we're saying the same thing over and over again, but we're doing that intentionally because this is such a profound paradigm shift, because truly all we've ever heard is just eat less and exercise more. And it's not that calorie quantity is irrelevant.
Exactly.
It's just that it's only one piece of a much more complicated puzzle. And we don't have to have PhDs to understand the complexity there, but we do need to understand really the core distinction, which is there's inputs into the system, and then there's the system itself.
Yes.
And if you're focusing completely on the quantity of inputs into the system, but the system is what's broken, like if your car engine is broken, putting less gas into it or more gas into it is just what? Like that doesn't do anything to solve that problem. And that's what we talk about the clogged sink. We talk about an elevated set point in my work. And it's not that the quantity of calories doesn't matter. Right. If you drink 10,000 calories of butter, you will not stimulate any secretion, but you will gain fat.
Yeah.
But no one does that, so it's somewhat irrelevant. And if you do eat the proper quality of food, the quantity of calories will take care of itself, and those high-quality calories will act almost like penicillin to a fever in the sense that they will help to clear that metabolic clog and fix the black box. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. And you know what? One thing we're both trying to get at is here, like in some level, this is far more complicated than we've all been taught, but on another level, for the most part, it's a lot simpler. And I think that's when we talk about all these analogies and metaphors and your clogged sinks and black box, I think people are like, what? Some level. But for the most part, most people who figure this stuff out, they realize, hey, this is 80% of the problem. If I just, eat these real foods, avoid the seed oils, your research, if you follow your guidance, I'm sure you're going to solve the vast majority of the problems for the vast majority of the people, the vast majority of the time.
Yeah, and the only reason you'd want to understand what we're talking about here is so that you can do that without cognitive dissonance. Because I still to this day, I hear people who read my book and read all kinds of books that when they eat a piece of meat that has fat on it, or they enjoy some nuts, they feel like they're doing something wrong or bad. Or if they're not hungry, they actually feel like they're doing something wrong or bad because their mind is still in this calorie quantity world. And if you can get your mind out of that world, life becomes so much easier and so much more delicious and so much more healthy. But the only way to do that is to give your mind a reason to leave that world. And that's what we're trying to do here, is we're trying to say, like, once you get this baseline understanding of the system is broken, fix the system, and whole, sane foods are what fix that system, then eating them won't make you feel bad anymore.
Exactly. And, and I think there's other thing about it is, like, even if for whatever reason the sink is clogged and it's not going to be fixed, or it's only going to be fixed a little bit, like, the key takeaway, I think, is that when you're following the logic here, if you're framing the problem correctly as a problem with a black box or a problem with a clogged sink or whatever you want to call it, you get away from this moralistic, judgmental idea about obesity, which is that, hey, you don't have self-control, you don't have willpower. It's all about you. And we have this puritanical, belief that gluttony and sloth cause this problem. And that's what I'm personally so frustrating, because I believe this idea for over 30 years, like everybody else. I thought, hey, people who get fat, they eat too much and it's, their fault. And that's just a horrible way. It's because it's untrue.
Well, and it's a nefarious, hope I'm using that word correctly. It's a nefarious problem because there's two things that happen simultaneously sometimes with obesity. And that's if you eat these processed starches and sweets that contain basically sugar, flour, soy, corn, and processed seed oils, they have been engineered such that they make you overconsume them because they don't satisfy you and they actually stimulate your appetite. So if you start to eat these foods, you will by definition overeat because consuming a lot of them is the only way to satisfy yourself. So here we see individuals overeating, and they are overeating. However, they're overeating because they're eating foods which require that. So it's not actually that the overeating is causing this to happen. It's that the consumption of these foods triggers overeating, which then results in obesity. So the answer is not just to eat a 100-calorie snack pack.
Right.
The answer is to not eat those foods that cause overeating.
Exactly. And, and the other thing about when you think about overeating is we're not just talking about, day to day. I think we're so focused on my calorie count for the day or, my carb count for the day or what have you, that we're missing the bigger picture, which is that obesity is a long-term proposition. And that, you can just go slight damage or slight dysregulation can lead to storage of fat. So, you might say, I'm just going to eat 100 calories of, snack packs of Little Debbie's snack cakes. I like them. And I'll just, starve myself a little bit. Well, that might work day to day, but over a long time, you're going to do stuff you're going to clog your sink. You might not see it all at once, but it's going to happen.
And that, Adam, is such a foundational point because once we understand that there's more than just calories taking place here, things like exercise is the antidote to obesity, like jogging, kind of goes away because we already understand, for example, that the problem with smoking is that it does damage to your respiratory system itself, and it cannot be undone via exercise because it's damaging the system. And if these insane packaged and processed foods are damaging the metabolic system itself, aka the sink, aka the black box, then doing more jogging or just eating less of them doesn't do anything to fix that. Like it does to your metabolism what smoking does to your lungs. And if you want to avoid lung cancer, you just can't smoke.
Right.
And if you want to avoid obesity, it's actually relatively simple. If you avoid these foods, the challenge we face, though, is that we live in a society today with packaged and processed foods, which is a bit like living in America in the 1920s where everyone smoked everywhere and avoiding secondhand smoke was nearly impossible.
Yeah.
So that's what we need to work to do is we live in a society which makes it very difficult to avoid these, what I like to call causal agents in this metabolic dysregulation. But truly, once we understand that those are the causal agents, we can focus our efforts on eating so much good stuff that we're too full for that stuff and really solve the problem rather than starving ourselves. And it's simple, but it might not be easy.
Exactly. It's simple, but not easy. And, one of the things I love about your program is the idea that it is kind of simple. And if your listeners haven't yet, done your diet or, gone on this kind of seed oil-less, sugarless kind of diet, it's you'd be amazed once you do because you really do. Your appetite changes. Your whole attitude towards food changes. A lot of the psychology changes too. You feel more in control. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people who are struggling with their weight feel is that they're out of control, that, they're doing what they've been told and it's still not working. And I'm sure it's incredibly frustrating. I've never been obese myself. I mean, at most I was like 15 or 20 pounds overweight, but, it can be, hard. And I think just any, chance to get some control over this and to stop doing things that aren't working, like jogging, is, a step in the right direction.
Love it, Adam. I love it. Well, this is where everyone who's listening to this podcast, please, and Adam, tell me if I miss anything here, but please go to Caloriegate.com and download this black box report that we've been talking to because it's got some really, I love the illustrations. Adam doesn't like these illustrations as much as I do, but I think they're wonderful because I think they help to add a levity to an otherwise very serious topic. And it's a very quick read. You can read it in 15, 20 minutes, and it will help to distill much of what we talked about here. And Adam's also got a wonderful low-carbers survival guide where when you do eliminate these processed starches and sweets, it's got some wonderful, helpful tips for you. And Adam, what's next for you and where else can people go to learn more about what you're doing?
Well, I'm blogging at Caloriegate. I'm actually having a podcast called Escape from Caloriegate, which is kind of along the lines that we're talking about. And I'm writing some more books. I like to be prolific and try to get the message out there.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Adam, thank you so much for your contribution here, because it really is this understanding. I really think we're going to look back in 30 years and just say, we're going to look at the way we treated obesity a bit like before we understood what viruses were and we treated people by bleeding them. So just, well, clearly your blood's infected, so we just need to eliminate the blood from your body. So let's just slit your wrists and allow you to bleed into this bucket until you feel better. Because now we're saying, well, it's just because you're eating too many calories, so let's just starve you to death. And no, the system is broken. So I really appreciate all the work you're doing there. And everyone, please, again, that's Caloriegate.com, and check out that black box report. Thank you so much, Adam. I really appreciate it. And everyone, this week, remember to eat more and exercise less, and do it smarter. Thanks so much, and have a great week.
Thanks, Jonathan.